All right, thank you for sticking with me through these technological difficulties. So we will start here. If you're following along on your PowerPoint, it's slide 8. So we will be continuing with the planter class. So again, don't confuse the term planter with the term farmer. When I'm referring to a farmer, or especially I try to use the term a yeoman farmer, I'm usually referring to the class of people who grow food for themselves. They're ordinary, plain people, right? But the planter class, is your class of people that they own large amounts of land, and they're the ones who usually own a significant number of enslaved people. Now, fewer than 2,000 families actually owned more than 100 slaves. And this is because slavery, or the business of slave ownership, was not something that was easy to go into. Now, a lot of small planters will aspire to gain a significant amount of wealth, but the price of slaves became far too expensive for them to enter this industry. Now, while slave ownership provided a path to wealth, a lot of people were never able to get to that point of gaining wealth, because in order to make money, you have to have money in the first place. So for an example to show how the price of these enslaved people became so expensive, the average price of an enslaved person in 1840 was about $1,000. By 1860, that price went to $1,800. Now, for us in 2020 terms, in 21st century terms rather, that probably doesn't seem like a lot. However, if you take about $1,800 in 1860 money, is approximately $40,000 in today's currency. So in order to own just one person, you had to have upwards of $40,000, which is quite a lot. So when I'm referring to the planter class who owns multiple people, right? These are the ones who have money. Now, because these people have money, this planter class will control the most fertile land. They will have control of the most fertile land in the territory. They have the highest incomes in their surrounding or in their area. And because of this large amount of wealth that they have, because of this large amount of money and social influence that they have, they often also dominate state and local politics. So the planter class will be, I will say, as far as the antebellum class structure, the planter class will occupy the top rung. Okay, the planter class will occupy the top rung of the antebellum Southern white class structure, because they're the ones who have the money, and because they have this large amount of wealth, they will end up dominating local and state politics. Now, typically when the class is in person, I have a slide, which is slide 9, if you're following along, where I have if you notice at the bottom left part of the screen, there's a picture of a woman who is breastfeeding a white child, and then there's a picture of a woman with this white child sitting on her lap. So I'd like to explain the first one that I noticed first. So the woman who is breastfeeding this child is known as a wet nurse. Okay, wet nurses were enslaved women who, while they may not, sometimes they would like women. A lot of the time they would like women who had just given birth, because her milk is thought to be fresh. And so they would have these enslaved women to breastfeed and to breastfeed their children. When you think about it, this really, I would say, is a perfect example of how slavery is so contradictory. You view these people as property. You view these people as inadequate and as inferior, so much so that you cannot share the same and occupy the same spaces and the same places within society. However, the process of breastfeeding is a very it's often a bonding experience with mother and child. And not only, do you have this bonding experience, but you also pass your immunity to the child. The child gets the immune benefits from the person they are breastfeeding from. And so while they couldn't occupy the same spaces in society, the same places in society, there was still this closeness, right, in slavery. Not familial closeness, not emotional closeness. We're really talking about spatial closeness. Another picture that I have is of a woman holding this white child. And I often ask students in class, who is the woman and who is this baby? And everyone assumes the woman, of course, is enslaved, but the baby must be the owner's child. In this case, because the parents had died, the woman, of course, is enslaved and she is holding her owner. Okay? She is holding this infant, this baby is the person who owns her. And this wasn't unusual. In a book that I read earlier this semester called They Were Her Property by, I think it's Stephanie Jones Rogers. In that book, they were her property, and it speaks of white women specifically as slave owners. It even spoke as young girls. It spoke of young girls as slave owners. And there were many instances where a 5-year-old could determine the fate of an enslaved person. They could be whipped at the whim of a 5-year-old having a tantrum. They could be sold at the whim of a child. Another picture that I have is of a man. It's actually a very popular picture. Many of you may have already seen it, but it's a man who has scars, keloided scars from the lash on his back. And I often ask my students also, if he were being sold, that is something that they would often show potential buyers. And a lot of students would ask why? Why would they show them that? To show that this person was disobedient. And so they got the lash so many times. So you know what you're purchasing. Okay. Now, one thing, and I asked this question also in an assignment this week. So the question here that I ask, and please pay attention to this, is what is paternalism? So paternalism is the practice from people in authority of restricting the freedom of subordinates for their supposed best interest. Okay, so I'll say that again. Paternalism is the practice from persons in authority of restricting the freedom of their subordinates for their supposed best interest. And you see a great amount of paternalism in the antebellum class structure. This idea that I am taking away your freedom for your own good. So I really ask about paternalism in an assignment that you have. If I'm not mistaken, it's your discussion. You'll be reading something called The Universal Law of Slavery by George Fitzhugh. And so you'll see paternalism, or you will read some of this or examples of paternalism in this reading. Sorry about that. So in the planter class, you see this paternalism as far as in the hierarchy. There's a racial hierarchy where they will restrict the rights of their enslaved property for their supposed own good, right? There's also the paternalism that has to do with gender, where a woman's rights may be restricted because it's for her own good. Because this idea was that Southern gentlemen, that it's their responsibility to care for their dependents, right? And so they see their wives often as dependents, their children as dependents, and their enslaved property as dependents. So it's this idea that enslaved people were deprived of their freedom for their own good. And paternalism is used as a justification of slavery. So if you can say, well, they don't know any better, so I have to take things away from them to keep them safe, then it justifies the brutality and it masks really the brutality of slavery, of that truth of slavery. So that is really how paternalism shows itself in American slavery. And you'll be able to see an example of that not only in the universal law of slavery, but also in Notes on the State of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson has a bit of paternalism when he says that blacks are inferior in the workings of both mind and body. And so it justifies enslavement because of this idea that they are inferior. And so you are restricting their freedom for their own good. So the antebellum white class structure. So at the very top, you have the planter elite. So your planter elite often came from where you have people who have generations of slave ownership, generations of wealth, generations of privilege. It would be that old money. It would be your planter elite. So your grandparents owned slaves, and their parents owned slaves, and their parents owned slaves. So it's generations of wealth and generations of slave ownership. Under them would be your new planters, where they gained wealth. But so if you've seen this movie called Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood, a phrase that they use in that movie is nouveau riche, meaning new money. So this money wasn't passed down through the generations. Your parents were probably poor and you were poor before you came up. So they would be under the planter class, because while they have money, it's not generational wealth, it's new money, right? Under them would be your yeomen or ordinary everyday farmers. They're small landowners. A lot of the times they don't own the land that's the most fertile, but they are planting really to support themselves and to support their families. And at the very bottom of the antebellum white class structure would be your poor, landless whites. Okay, so those who dreamed of owning land, who were often employed by the plantation owner, often as overseers or as slave drivers. Okay. So that is your antebellum class structure. Now, there were a lot of people who were, obviously, because it's the South and it has slavery, there are a number of people who will make a pro-slavery argument. And this pro-slavery argument is rooted in racism and white supremacy. The pro-slavery argument is rooted in racism and white supremacy, the belief that white people are superior to any other person of color. There was also a large amount of biblical legitimation. So in the Bible, there is a verse that says that slaves are to be, or servants, be obedient to them that are your earthly masters according to the flesh, meaning that slaves are to obey their masters. And they would often use this biblical legitimation in order as a source of control, right? As a means of control. So if you as an enslaved person, if you aren't obeying your master, then you are thus being disobedient to God, because it is God's command that you be obedient to your earthly masters as you would be obedient to Christ. And so there is often this biblical legitimation that it's a biblical legitimation that says, like, this is what it's meant to be. This is how things were meant to be. Also, another pro-slavery argument at this time is that it was essential to human progress. Slavery has existed for most of human history. However, America's slavery is very unique in that it is not only, it's a status that is inherited, that is passed down, where people are not seen as people, where they are seen as property. It is chattel slavery. All of these pro-slavery arguments guarantee equality for whites by preventing the growth of blacks and working class whites. Okay, so I'm going to stop this and go to a part 3, and I'll pick up on slavery and the law. See you in a bit.